The Biden campaign is in the final stretch of vetting a vice presidential candidate, and they've got a large group to choose from, with Joe Biden personally interviewing the top contenders later this week amid fierce lobbying by Democrats for their respective picks. His decision is expected next week, a week before the start of the largely virtual Democratic convention in Milwaukee. Joining me now, NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli, former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele, and senior opinion writer for the Boston Globe, Kimberly Atkins. Mike, you are our veteran Biden watcher. He was at the beach this week in Rehoboth, according to your reporting. And what is the status of the search? Where do you think this thing is going?
Yeah, that's right, Andrea. A little bit of a change of scenery for the former vice president. As Biden advisors tell my colleague Kristen Welker, Carol Lee, and myself, the ball is entirely now in Joe Biden's court. The process, as you indicate, expected to play out through the week, an announcement not likely until next week, in fact. And that reflects the fact that once Biden fully engaged in this process himself, things get a little bit more deliberative. One of the things the campaign is also waiting for is some polling data to come back on each of the potential VPs. You've heard Jim Clyburn say over and over again that the campaign needs to get several things right, the vetting as well as the polling. And then ultimately, the ultimate search committee for Joe Biden is his head, his heart, and his gut. And those one-on-one conversations that we expect this week are going to be so critical for that. Over and over again, Biden campaign aides saying that the personal chemistry that he has with his potential vice president is really one of the final factors that's going to weigh into his consideration. The question, of course, Andrea, is will he be able to do those meetings in person? We're obviously on the lookout for any signs of those potential vice presidential picks coming here to Delaware to have those meetings. But in addition to the concerns about COVID and the health and safety that are relevant to that discussion, we also have a storm coming here in the next 24 hours that might impact it. But all indications are the list has narrowed some. But another thing the campaign advisors are telling us is that the former vice president is likely to want to hear sound out his aides on some of the names that might necessarily have fallen off the radar. Gretchen Whitmer first among them, somebody who he developed a close relationship over the past several years.
And we all know how important Michigan is. Before I move on, I want to ask you, from our reporting at the end of the week, it seemed to be Harris, Rice, and Karen Bass moving up. What is your take after this weekend about the strengths of each and potential drawbacks?
Yeah, I think the candidate we saw most on the defensive, of course, was Congresswoman Karen Bass. She was late to the vice presidential search process. The vetting began a little bit later, and we're seeing obviously some of the issues coming out. Her past comments, her travels to Cuba, first and foremost among them, the Republicans, the Trump campaign seizing on them over the weekend. Also questions about the remarks she gave at a Church of Scientology event in her district. Kamala Harris, of course, has always been the betting favorite since even before both individuals got into the presidential race. There's a seeming natural chemistry between them, a relationship that goes back. But the test that's being applied not just to Kamala Harris, but to everyone in this process is the question of whether or not they can be seen as a team player. We've seen questions raised about her ambition from Biden allies. That's provoked the charges of sexism. The campaign very concerned about that. We saw the campaign manager weigh in, saying all women of ambition win, and that the former vice president will choose somebody who is an ambitious woman in the end. And then, of course, Susan Rice, Andrea, the relationship there that they forged in the Obama White House, so critical. They've worked in the trenches together. But the question there is how much of a campaign issue they allow to be brought in, the issues of Benghazi, and of course the unmasking debate, which the president and his team have really wanted to jumpstart in the conversation.
Well, the unmasking debate was a complete false flag, and as well as Benghazi, but also she has not run for elected office. But they will try to sully anyone who is chosen, of course. But Kimberly, we've seen a really unseemly lobbying back and forth. There's certainly a lot of competition here, but some comments that were made about Kamala Harris, and then what has all the hallmarks, according to California Democrats who know this process, of a real oppo dump against Karen Bass.
Yes, and one concern that some Democrats have is ahead of this deliberate process, which, you think about folks wanting this process to wrap up quickly. It seems that former Vice President Joe Biden is more interested in getting it right than getting it fast, which, when you're talking about somebody who is a heartbeat away from the presidency, is the right way to go. But this lead up and back and forth is really seeming to pit particularly Black women against each other and raise questions about the ambition of Black women at a time where you are hearing from across the spectrum a lot of people saying that the choice should be a Black woman among all of these very qualified candidates. It's not a matter of qualification. It's a matter of each of these women bring different things to the office and what Joe Biden is looking for in that partner. But that back and forth, those claims that Senator Harris is too ambitious and others, is really at the same time giving a black eye to a bit of this process, and perhaps it would be it'd be better for Democrats to step back, let the vice president pick who he thinks would be his best teammate. And these are all qualified people who I am certain we will see if Joe Biden wins in his cabinet or playing other prominent roles in his administration. So it seems like it's a total win, and this sort of bickering and oppo research being done against one another is only causing problems within the party.
Indeed. And what about the fact that Elizabeth Warren polls best with progressives, Kimberly? My own take on this is, at this point in history, at this point in the campaign in America, that Joe Biden really is most likely to choose a Black woman. What if he were to go to an Elizabeth Warren?
Well, look, on the one hand,
that could then cost them a Senate seat.
Yeah, on the one hand, and look, any cost of a Senate seat out of Massachusetts at this point would be temporary. I think it's really certain, despite the fact that Massachusetts has a Republican governor, he would install someone temporarily. There'd be a special election, and I'd bet money that a Democrat would win that. But Elizabeth Warren polls well, not just among progressives, she also polls well among Black voters. And there is not a universal thought that a Black woman must be chosen at this time. Certainly, if it's somebody who Black voters like Elizabeth Warren. Keep in mind, she was the woman who did best in the presidential primary. At the same time, Joe Biden would risk the idea that he is missing a moment in choosing one of only two white women who are still under consideration among his very qualified folks. Also, there are a lot of roles that Elizabeth Warren could also serve in a Biden administration. So it's a tough choice that the former vice president is making, but Elizabeth Warren is not counted out yet.
And Michael Steele, when we talk about this, is it going on too long? Is the process too cumbersome, or is this just the waiting period where a lot of bad things happen? By the way, Harris is, I understand, the only one who was accorded the opportunity to defend herself against some of the criticism to the vetting group, not in a conversation with Biden, as far as we know, but to the vetters themselves.
Well, I think to your first point, Andrea, it's not gone on too long. This is part and parcel of the process. The presidential nominee doesn't typically announce his vice presidential choice until a week or two out before the convention itself, usually the week of the convention, going into the convention to sort of set the tone and the stage to have this rah-rah moment. I think Joe Biden has done this exactly right. I think where he may have tripped up a little bit was sort of indicating so early on in the process that he would select a woman. It created a racial space that my sense is a lot of folks in the campaign are uncomfortable with. They don't want to be dictated to. They don't want these other influences to dictate how the vice presidential choice is made. But they're here now. And so they're going to have to go through this process. And the question that at the end of all of this that really matters is, if he picks someone other than a Black female, what is the response of the Democratic Party? Not what is the response of the country, what is the response of the Democratic Party? And that's an unfortunate spot to be in if that's what it boils down to, because the race in November is against Donald Trump, not against his vice presidential choice. And the Trump campaign certainly will want to play that up. The Biden campaign is trying to avoid that narrative to maximize everything that's been said so far in this conversation. But at the end of the day, want everyone to know that the vice presidential choice is just one of many important choices he has to make. And this is his partner, regardless.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.